The wind was sharp across the prairie that evening, carrying with it the smell of dust, smoke, and secrets too old to name. The sun was sinking low, casting fire over the hills, and all eyes in town turned toward the rider coming in slow from the horizon. His boots were worn, his hat pulled low, his face half hidden in shadow, but his arrival was no small thing, because everyone knew what his presence meant. He wasn't just a traveler looking for work or a cowboy passing through. No, this man had come to answer a call much older than himself, a call bound not by love or choice, but by a law carved deep into tradition. If he dared claim the hand of one sister, he must marry them all. They whispered about it in the saloon before he even tied his horse. Some said he didn't know the truth yet. Some swore he did, but thought himself strong enough to bear it. And others, well, they figured he'd be running by morning once the weight of that law pressed down on him. But the law was no joke, and the family he'd tied himself to was no ordinary one. For sisters, each with her own fire, her own dreams, her own claim on his life if he stayed, and by the ancient word that still lingered in this land. He couldn't choose just one. The youngest of them was quick with a laugh, but sharp with her tongue, always ready to remind a man he wasn't as clever as he thought. The second, quieter, carried her strength not in words, but in a steady gaze that could strip away every lie. The third sister, restless and untamed, had a spirit that made men cautious to stand too close. And the eldest, well, her eyes held something the cowboy couldn't yet name, something that made the rest of the town step carefully in her presence. Together, they weren't just sisters. They were the guardians of an old promise. And now he stood at the heart of it. The cowboy hadn't meant to ride into such a knot of fate. His journey had started plain enough. A man chasing the horizon, trading one dusty trail for another, looking for work and a place to breathe. But fate has a way of setting snares in the open plains. A smile offered, a hand held too long. A night under a starlit porch, little moments that tied him closer to one of them before he even realized what it meant. He thought it was choice. He thought it was love, or maybe just the beginning of it. But out here, choice was not always yours to make. The townsfolk told the story of that law in hushed tones. Long ago, a family had been torn apart when outsiders tried to take just one daughter, leaving the others to fend for themselves. The feud that followed burned through generations until a pact was made. No sister would ever be left behind again. If a man wished to join the family, he joined them all. Some called it cruel, others called it sacred, but it stood unbroken, and the sisters he'd met were living proof of it. Now the cowboy sat alone in the quiet of his rented room, staring at the walls that seemed to close tighter with every tick of the clock. Outside, he could hear the town moving, the shuffle of boots, the laughter spilling from the saloon, the gossip that followed him like a shadow. He tried to tell himself he could ride out before dawn, leave the whole thing behind. But his heart wasn't so simple. Something in him already belonged there. Already bound to the family he'd stumbled into, what would it mean to share his life with not one partner, but all of them? What would it mean to stand before the world and carry the weight of such a law? And most of all, what would it mean for them? For the sisters who had grown up under the burden of tradition, each with their own hopes, their own fears, their own scars, he could see it in their eyes when they looked at him. For one, he might be the dream. For another, the cage. For yet another, the chance to test just how far she could push before he broke. The night grew darker, and the sound of boots creaked on the porch outside his window. He froze, hand resting near the revolver at his side, though he didn't draw it. A soft knock came, 3 measured taps, and his heart pounded harder than it ever had in a shootout. He opened the door, and there she stood, the eldest sister. Framed in lantern light, her face calm, but her voice carrying the weight of generations. "You've set your path. Cowboy," she said, her words steady as stone. "But do you know where it leads? Tomorrow, you'll stand before us all. One choice, and there is no turning back. You take one sister, you take us all." Her words lingered in the air like smoke, impossible to wave away. He wanted to answer, to say he wasn't afraid, or that love would be enough, or even that he'd walk away. But none of those words came. Instead, silence hung heavy between them. And in that silence, he felt the ground shift beneath his feet. Because this wasn't just about him anymore. It wasn't just about tradition or law or even love. It was about the four women whose lives would be tied to his in ways he couldn't yet imagine. It was about the choice he thought was his, now revealed as something much larger. Something bound to the bones of the land itself. She turned to leave. But before stepping into the night, she glanced back over her shoulder. "Rest well," she said softly. "You'll need your strength." And then she was gone, leaving him with the creak of the empty room and the storm rising in his chest. He leaned back against the door, breath shallow, eyes fixed on nothing, yet seeing everything. Tomorrow was coming fast, and with it, a vow he could neither escape nor fully understand. The prairie outside lay still, the stars wide and unblinking, as if watching to see whether he would bend beneath the weight or rise to meet it. And though he didn't know yet which way his heart would turn, one thing was certain: when the sun rose over that old town, nothing would ever be the same again. The night stretched long for the cowboy, though he barely slept a wink. Every creak of the old inn seemed louder. Every whisper of wind against the window made him turn his head. He lay there, staring at the ceiling, the eldest sister's words echoing over and over. Tomorrow, he would stand before them. Tomorrow, he would either carry the weight of the ancient law or run from it. But running never came easy to a man who'd lived his life trying to prove he wasn't afraid of anything. Still, he wondered if this was the one thing that might finally break him. When dawn came, the town stirred early. The air was crisp, the streets damp with morning dew, and yet the people gathered as if waiting for a show. They lined the boardwalks, whispering behind hats and shawls, glancing up at the cowboy's window whenever they thought he wasn't looking. He could feel the judgment pressing down before he'd even stepped outside. In their eyes, he was already trapped by fate. A stranger riding into town, unaware of the net he'd walked straight into. He saddled his horse, not to ride out, but to steady his nerves. The familiar leather, the solid weight of the animal beneath his hand, was the one thing that still felt certain. He told himself he could leave, that no rope held him here. Yet when he looked toward the horizon, the trail seemed to fade into nothing. His feet wouldn't move in that direction. Something invisible tethered him to the sisters, to the house that sat just beyond the town on the edge of the wide plains. The townsfolk knew every story about that family. Children grew up hearing them whispered by firelight, and grown men carried them like warnings carved in bone. No outsider ever came close without consequence. Some had tried. A few years back, a merchant's son from the east had come courting the second sister. He left in the night pale as a ghost, never to return. Others had tested their luck, but none stayed. The law was a wall no man had dared climb. Until now, as the cowboy walked through town, eyes followed him. Some with pity, some with suspicion, and others with quiet hope. There were those who believed the old law was too cruel, too heavy for anyone to bear, and maybe this man was the one stubborn enough to change it. But change out here came slowly, and often at a price. The sisters' home stood apart from the rest. A large house weathered by storms and time, yet proud in its stance. Its porch stretched wide, its windows glinted in the early sun, and the land around it rolled out like it belonged only to them. To approach it was to step into another world. He could feel it as he drew near. The weight of history thick in the air. The youngest sister greeted him first. Barefoot on the porch, her laughter breaking the silence like a bell. But beneath her teasing smile was a sharpness that warned him she'd be no easy match. "You look nervous," she said, leaning on the post as if she had all the time in the world. "Don't worry, cowboy. You'll either stay and learn, or ride away and prove you weren't half as brave as you seemed." Inside, the house smelled of wood smoke and herbs. The walls lined with old photographs and worn furniture that spoke of a family rooted deep in the land. The second sister sat by the window, her eyes calm but watchful, hands folded neatly in her lap. She didn't speak right away, but when she did, her words carried a weight that made him straighten his back. "Every choice has a shadow," she said softly. "Yours will not just follow you, it will follow us." The third sister appeared in the hallway,
By her steps quick.
her presence alive with restless energy. She eyed him with something between challenge and curiosity. "You think you're ready for this?" she asked, tilting her head. Men always think they are, till the law shows them just how small they really are. And then the eldest entered, her voice steady, her gaze fixed on him with an intensity that made the room feel colder. She spoke no more than a few words, but it was enough. "Sit," she told him, and he did. In that moment, he knew he wasn't in control here. They sat around the table, the four of them, and he across from them. The air was heavy with silence, broken only by the ticking of the clock on the mantel. It felt less like a conversation and more like a trial. He wanted to speak, to explain himself, to tell them he hadn't meant to step into this, but his throat tightened. The law didn't care for explanations. Finally, the eldest leaned forward. "You came here because of her?" she said, glancing toward the sister who had first caught his eye. The cowboy's heart thudded. She was right. That one moment, her smile under the lantern light, her hand brushing his, had been enough to pull him into all of this. "But what you must understand," the eldest continued, "is that choosing her means choosing all of us. Do you think your heart can hold that?" The question sat heavy in the room. He searched their faces, each so different, each carrying her own fire. Could love stretch wide enough to cover them all? Could duty? Could he? He didn't know, and the not knowing burned at him. The sisters rose, one by one, leaving him alone at the table with the weight of their words pressing down. He sat there long after they'd gone, listening to the house creak and the wind scrape against the shutters. He thought of his past, the towns he'd left, the roads he'd traveled, the faces of people he'd never see again. He had always been free, always able to ride on when things grew too heavy. But now, for the first time, he wondered if freedom was just another kind of loneliness. When he stepped back outside, the town seemed different. The air thicker, the stairs sharper. He realized the people weren't just waiting to see what he'd do, they were waiting to see. If the law itself would bend or break around him, he wasn't just a man caught in a family's fate anymore. He was part of something larger, something the whole town had been watching for years. That night, as the stars came out, the cowboy sat on the porch of the inn, his hat tipped low, his mind circling the same thought over and over. Was it braver to stay or braver to leave? He had no answer, but he knew tomorrow would demand one. And as the wind carried the sound of laughter and voices from the sisters, house across the plains, he felt both drawn and haunted. Caught between the promise of belonging and the fear of being swallowed whole by it. The law was waiting, and so were they. And deep down he understood, whatever choice he made, it would mark him forever. The days that followed pressed down on the cowboy like a storm that would not break. Each morning he woke to the same gnawing thought he could still ride away. Yet by sundown he was still there, tied by invisible threads that pulled him back toward the sister's house. The town seemed to hold its breath, waiting, as though his choice would either renew or shatter something sacred. And the sisters themselves watched him in their own ways, each carrying a different question in her eyes, as if testing to see which part of him would crack first. The youngest sister often lingered near him, her laughter sharp, but her curiosity sharper. She seemed to enjoy poking at him, watching how he shifted under the weight of her words. "You think you're free?" she said one evening, standing with her arms crossed as the sun dipped behind the hills. "But you're already in the middle of it. That's what you don't see. We were raised knowing this law would find us, but you walked straight into the fire." Her words stung, not because they were cruel, but because they rang true. He had come with no knowledge of the old ways. Now he was caught in them, tighter than any rope. The second sister revealed herself slowly. She didn't taunt or press, but her gaze carried questions that were harder to shake. One night, as the cowboy helped mend a broken fence on their land, she stood watching quietly. When the work was done, she stepped closer and asked in a voice low but steady, "Do you understand what it means to live for more than yourself? To share not only your days, but your burdens with all of us?" He had no answer. The silence between them stretched long, and in that silence, he felt the true weight of what she meant. It wasn't just marriage. It was a vow to carry 4 different lives, 4 different hearts, all bound to him. The third sister was different still. She carried herself with fire, her words quick, her movements restless. She challenged him at every turn, almost daring him to prove he wasn't just another drifter with bold words and empty promises. Once, when the cowboy spoke of his travels, of towns and rivers and mountains he had seen, she scoffed. "That's the talk of a man who never had to stay," she said. "You think those stories make you strong? But strength is measured by what you can endure, not by what you can leave behind." Her defiance lit something inside him, a spark that made him both frustrated and strangely alive. The eldest, however, remained the greatest mystery. She spoke little, but every word carried the gravity of someone who had already made peace with her fate. To the cowboy, she seemed less interested in what he wanted and more in whether he could survive what lay ahead. When he asked her once why the law still held power after all these years, she looked at him with a gaze so steady it almost froze him in place. "Because promises outlive the people who make them," she said simply. "And because this land remembers, we are bound to it as much as it is bound to us." Yet beyond the house, the whispers of the town grew louder. Some of the men muttered that the law was unfair, that no man should be forced into such a bond. Others argued it was the only thing that kept the sisters safe, that it was a shield built from the ashes of old betrayal. The women of the town held their own opinions, some sympathetic, others wary. To them, the sisters were both envied and pitied for their strength, pitied for the cage they had been born into. And in the saloon, under the haze of smoke and whiskey, men began to place bets on whether the cowboy would stay or flee before the week was done. But deeper still, a shadow grew, a tension not only between the cowboy and the sisters, but among the sisters themselves. For though they had grown up under the same roof, each carried her own view of the law, her own dream of what it should mean. The youngest spoke of it like a game, but there was fear under her laughter. The second believed in its weight, but quietly longed for choice. The third despised it, yet embraced it as a weapon against weakness. And the eldest held it like a torch, keeping the flame alive, even when it threatened to burn her. The cowboy began to notice the cracks. Small arguments sparked between them when they thought he wasn't listening. A slammed door, a sharp word, a silence that stretched too long at the dinner table. They might have been bound by law, but inside, they were still 4 very different women, each with her own fire. And he, whether he liked it or not, had become the point where all those fires met. One evening, found himself walking the edge of town, the night air heavy with the scent of sage and dust. He heard footsteps behind him and turned to see the second sister. She stood with her hands clasped, her eyes searching his face. "Do you ever think about leaving?" she asked. Her voice wasn't accusing, it was almost gentle. He admitted that he did every morning. But he also admitted that something kept him rooted. She nodded, as though she already knew. Then she whispered, almost to herself, "Maybe the law isn't the only thing that binds people." The words stayed with him, turning over and over in his mind. Was it the law holding him there, or was it something else? Something unspoken, something he couldn't yet name. He thought of the way each sister carried herself, the way each tested him, the way each seemed to pull at a different part of who he was. It wasn't just obligation, it was the strange pull of belonging, being seen and measured in ways he had never been before. Still, the conflict pressed closer, heavier. The law demanded he take all of them, but the reality was far more complicated. Could one man's heart stretch wide enough? Could theirs? Or would the weight of the old promise crush them all before it even began? And as he lay awake again that night, staring at the ceiling, he heard the faint sound of voices drifting from the sisters' house across the plains. They were arguing, sharp and low, their words carried thin by the wind. He couldn't hear all of it, but he caught enough to know one thing for certain. It wasn't just him fighting against the law. The sisters themselves were caught in its grip, and not all of them were willing to stay bound without a fight. The tension thickened, stretching across the town, across the family, across his own heart. And with each passing day, he knew the breaking point was drawing nearer. Though he could not yet see which way it would fall, the days blurred into one another. Yet each hour seemed to tighten the knot around the cowboy's fate. By now, he could feel the law pressing on him like the weight of the mountains. A law that belonged not only to the sisters, but to the land itself. Wherever he walked, the townsfolk's eyes followed him. The saloon grew quieter when he entered. Conversation shifted when his boots hit the porch. It was as though everyone waited for the moment when choice would give way to consequence. The sisters. House had grown heavier too. Their words, once sharp but separate, now collided in ways that could no longer be ignored. The youngest laughed less, though her wit still cut when she used it. The second sister watched more closely, her silence almost more unsettling than any outburst. The third became restless, her temper flashing quick as lightning, and the eldest carried herself like a storm barely held at bay. Each day the cowboy found himself caught between them, their different tempers and truths drawing him in opposite directions until he thought he might split apart. One evening, as the sun bled red over the horizon, the town gathered for a meeting in the old hall. The cowboy hadn't been invited, but he went anyway. Inside, the air was thick with voices, angry, fearful, questioning. The law was older than any of them, but the presence of a stranger had stirred doubt in ways no one dared admit before. Some shouted that the law was cruel, that it bound not only the sisters, but the entire town, to a past no one alive remembered clearly. Others roared that it was sacred, that breaking it would bring ruin on them all. The cowboy stood at the back, his hat pulled low, listening as his name was spoken like both a curse and a hope. When the meeting ended, no decision had been made. The town remained divided, and the weight of that division settled on his shoulders. He left before anyone could stop him, the echo of their voices chasing him out into the dark. He rode his horse beyond the edge of the fields, needing air, needing space. Yet even beneath the wide sweep of stars, he couldn't escape the truth. This was no longer just between him and the sisters. The whole town was tied to what would happen next. Back at the house, the sisters were waiting. They had argued while he was gone. He could see it in their eyes, the way they avoided one another, the tension that crackled in the silence. The third sister finally broke it, her voice sharp. "You're dragging us into something we didn't choose. Maybe you should leave before it's too late." The youngest flinched at her words but said nothing. The second looked at the cowboy, her gaze heavy with questions. And the eldest only stood, arms crossed, her presence filling the room. "You think leaving will save you?" she asked, her voice cutting through the air. "The law doesn't vanish if he rides away. It follows us. It always will. Unless—" She didn't finish the thought, but the silence left behind was thick with possibility, with danger. The cowboy felt the ground shift beneath him. It wasn't just the law binding him to them, it was the cracks between them, cracks that might widen into something none of them could control. He wanted to speak, to steady the room, but every word he might have said caught in his throat. All he could do was stand there, caught between their eyes, caught between their truths. The nights grew longer, filled with tension that refused to break. The cowboy found himself lying awake, listening again to the sisters' voices drifting through the walls. Sometimes it was laughter, sharp and fleeting. But more often, it was whispers and arguments, words spoken too low to catch, but heavy enough to make his chest tighten. Each day he woke more worn, more certain that something was building, something that could no longer be avoided, and then came the storm. It rolled in without warning, black clouds swallowing the horizon, thunder cracking over the plains. The rain came hard, lashing against the earth, rattling the windows of the house. The town huddled in silence, but inside the sisters' home, the storm outside was nothing compared to the one inside. The youngest burst into tears, confessing she feared the law more than anything, that she wished she could run, but had nowhere to go. The second tried to soothe her, but her voice trembled as she admitted she doubted whether they could live this way. The third paced like a caged animal, fury spilling from her words as she cursed the law, cursed the town, cursed the cowboy for not riding out when he had the chance. And the eldest stood tall, her voice rising above the thunder, declaring that they had no choice but to see it through. The cowboy felt the storm tear at him from every side. He had always thought himself strong, but strength meant nothing here. He was not fighting bandits or wild country. he was fighting promises. Fighting history, fighting hearts that wanted different things but were forced into one. He looked at the sisters, each of them burning with her own fire, and he knew the choice he made would not only bind them, but could break them. The storm raged through the night, and when morning came, the world was changed. Fences lay broken, the streets of town were drowned in mud, and the land itself seemed scarred by the violence of it. The people looked weary, their eyes filled with the same question: what now? And as the sun struggled to break through the clouds, the cowboy stood once more at the edge of the sisters' porch, his hat dripping with rain. Behind him, the town gathered, silent but waiting. Before him, the four sisters stood together, their faces set, their eyes locked on him. This was the moment. The air felt electric, the weight of every whispered story and every broken promise pressing down on them all. The cowboy's heart pounded, his breath shallow. As the sisters stepped forward, each waiting for the word that would seal their fates, the law demanded an answer. The town demanded an answer. The sisters demanded an answer. And as the silence deepened, the cowboy knew there was no turning back. Whatever he chose, the world would never be the same again. The silence before the cowboy's answer stretched so long that the air itself seemed to hold its breath. The townsfolk shifted nervously behind him, boots scuffing on wet boards, while the sisters stood rooted in front of him, their faces hard, their hearts unreadable. Lightning still flickered in the distance from the storm that had passed, and every flash lit their eyes with a fire that made his chest ache. He had wandered into many towns in his life, but never one where his soul had been weighed so heavily against the weight of history. Finally, he spoke not in a grand voice, but in the low, steady tone of a man who had made peace with himself. He admitted that he had been afraid, that he had thought more than once of running. But he also confessed that something deeper kept him here, something he could not shake. It wasn't just duty, and it wasn't just the law. It was them, their strength, their defiance, their laughter, their fire. He could not choose one, because to choose one was to deny the truth of all. And maybe that was what the law had meant all along. The words did not end the storm inside the sisters, but they stilled the air enough for them to hear one another. The youngest wiped her tears and whispered that maybe she didn't want him to leave after all. The second lowered her gaze, her silence carrying more acceptance than any speech. The third looked at him like she wanted to fight him, then shook her head as if she'd lost the will. And the eldest, after what felt like forever, nodded once, sharp and final. "Then you stay," she said. The town erupted with voices. Some cheered, relieved the ancient law had been honored. Others grumbled, muttering that it wasn't right that no man should be bound this way. But the decision was made, and the weight of it settled across every soul like dust on old wood. The days that followed were not easy. The sisters did not suddenly become one mind, nor did the cowboy find all his fears washed away. Instead, they stumbled, argued, and tested one another. The youngest demanded freedom in small rebellions, running barefoot through the fields, laughing when others frowned. The second kept order, steadying the household when tempers flared. The third pushed him hardest, daring him to prove his worth, not with words but with action, fixing fences, facing storms, standing tall when others might bend. And the eldest kept the law alive in her gaze, reminding him that this bond was not only theirs, but carried on the breath of those who had come before. The cowboy worked the land with them, ate at their table, learned the rhythm of their lives. Slowly, the sharp edges dulled. The arguments softened into debates, the silence between them filled with something warmer than suspicion. The town, too, shifted. Where once they watched him with suspicion, now they watched with curiosity, some even with respect. They saw he had not fled, and that counted for more than most words ever could. Yet there were nights when the cowboy still lay awake, staring at the ceiling, wondering what freedom meant now. Once freedom had been the open road, the endless horizon. Now freedom seemed to mean something else. The choice to stay when leaving was the easier path. It was a kind of belonging he had never known, and though it scared him, it also gave him a strength he hadn't felt before. The sisters, too, changed. Bound together by law, yes, but also bound by the choice they had made to let him in. The youngest grew braver, not just in laughter, but in trust. The second found her quiet voice could guide more than it restrained. The third discovered that her fire, though fierce, could also protect. And the eldest learned that even laws can live in new ways when carried by willing hearts instead of weary ones as seasons turned. The story of the cowboy and the four sisters became part of the town's own history. Children whispered about it at night. Men spoke of it at the saloon. Women measured it against their own hopes and doubts. Some saw it as proof that the law still held power. Others saw it as proof that even old laws could take new shape when tested by flesh and bone. Years later, when the cowboy stood at the edge of the same porch, looking out over the plains, he felt the land speak to him in a way he had never noticed before. It wasn't just wild country anymore, it was home. And though he still carried the dust of the road in his veins, he knew he no longer wandered. He had found his place, not by escaping, but by standing still when it mattered most. The sisters stood beside him, their lives still different. Their fires still their own, but together. The law had not broken them. Instead, it had forced them to face themselves, to fight, to bend, and finally to stand as one. And in that strange, ancient bond, they found something that was more than duty, more than law. They found a kind of love born not from choosing, but from enduring. The townsfolk, too, found lessons in the story. Some spoke of the courage it took to stay, others of the strength it took to accept. And slowly, the whispers of doubt grew quieter, replaced by a new respect for the way the sisters and the cowboy carried their bond. For the cowboy, the takeaway was simple but heavy. Freedom is not always the road beneath your boots, nor the horizon ahead. Sometimes, freedom is the choice to stay when every part of you wants to run. Sometimes it is the courage to carry more than you think you can and to find in the carrying that your heart is bigger than you ever believed. The story ended not with a single moment of triumph, but with the steady rhythm of life days of work, nights of laughter and arguments, seasons of hardship and harvest. It was not perfect, and it was not easy, but it was real. And in the end, that was enough. The cowboy, who once lived only for himself, learned that belonging was the hardest road of all. And the sisters, who once feared the weight of the law, discovered that sharing it made them stronger. The town, bound by old promises, saw a new story take root in the dust and the wind. A story that would outlive them all. And so the tale of the cowboy and the four sisters came to rest. Not as a legend of escape or defiance, but as a story of endurance, of choice, of love forged in fire and bound by law. A story that whispered through the fields and echoed in the hearts of all who heard it, reminding them that even the oldest laws can be reshaped by the courage to stay.